Since AMP stories are just like any other AMP page, make sure that you include the boilerplate code in your AMP. Then make sure that you add a title, which is basically the name of your story. You have added the canonical, and then the rest of the attributes in the head are just the boilerplate AMP code. Next, make sure you include the AMP story component in the head, just like any other component. Then fire up Google Chrome and make sure that you have installed the AMP validation plugin, since it will validate our AMP story as we code along. After you have done all that, we can start coding our AMP story. Make sure that you include the entire story right below the body tag, okay? No other element should be above the body tag, or excuse me, no other element should be above the story. The entire page should include just one story. So we have to start with the amp-story element, and our whole story will be included in between those elements, and they must be the first child of the body tag. Next, there's some attributes that are mandatory in order for our story to validate. The first attribute is standalone. This tells the browser that this page is only an AMP story. It has no other content but the story, okay? Then the next attribute is the title. Now, so this is the name of your story. The name of our story is Quotes of Great Generals. Now, the title attribute's contents are not going to appear anywhere in our story, but it is used within the AMP ecosystem. So, for example, AMP will use the title and the rest of the attributes, for example, to show them up in Google search engine results page, and it will show them up in like a preview of the bookend JSON that we're going to look into afterwards. So those, even though those attributes won't appear anywhere in your story, they're still important, and they're telling the browser that basically this is a story and this is like a metadata. Just like the metadata you include in your head, this is what those attributes of the amp-story element is going to do for your story. Okay, so the next attribute is publisher, and this is not the same as the author of the story. This is just the company that publishes the story. So, for example, let's say that our publisher is Stephanie Web Design. Stephanie Web Design History. Okay, let's make believe that I have a history website, since this story is Quotes of Great Generals. And the next thing we want to do is we want to add the attribute publisher logo source. Okay, so this is going to be a link to our logo, but there are a couple of caveats. The logo must not be SVG, it must be square, and it must be a minimum of 96 by 96 pixels. Okay, so let me add my logo and let me show it to you guys. This is the logo I'm going to use for the AMP story, and it's square, it's 96 by 96. It could be larger than 96 by 96, but 96 by 96 is the mandatory minimum resolution, okay? And it must not be background transparent, which is very important because we're used to logos being background transparent, but you cannot do that if you want to include it in your story. And this logo is not going to appear anywhere in our story, but like I said, it will appear in the AMP ecosystem, for example, in search results or in the recommended links at the end of the story. Now, the next attribute that we want is poster portrait source. Okay, so what a poster is an image that is shown to the user while the AMP story is loading. So, for example, if you are loading the story from a 3G or 2G phone and it takes a while, the user is going to see the poster, and then they're going to see the cover or the first page of the story. And the reason we have to include the portrait attribute text is because you can have a portrait or a landscape poster depending on what you have. And in my case, I'm going to include the cover image. And usually posters are just cover images of the story, but make sure you include them because first it's mandatory, and second of all, you never know what kind of phone the user has or what kind of connection they have. So I'm just going to include my cover image as a poster. Let me show you my cover image. This is the first image that's going to appear on my AMP story, so I'm going to use it as a poster as well. So while the user is loading the AMP story, they're going to see this image that we have specified in our code right here as a value of poster-portrait-source. Also, I misspelled the word portrait. I wrote portrait instead of portrait. So we need an R. Oops, misspelled it again. Okay, now let's save and test our story to see how it looks. Okay, right now it is just a black abyss with a button that doesn't do anything. And our validator is saying that we have no content in our AMP story. So see, it's just an empty element. So we need to add some content, but it's going okay. We'll add some elements soon. So in order to add some content in our story, what we need is another element called AMP story page, okay? So what this is imagine a slider. So this is going to be our slide, so to say, that contains numerous elements like images or text, headings, paragraphs, you name it. But it's going to be contained within the AMP story page, and you can have many AMP stories pages that your story requires, okay? And all the content is going to be in between them. So while the AMP story is like a wrapper, the AMP story page is actually going to display the content, okay? And the AMP story page has one mandatory attribute called ID. So you need to include the ID of every story. And I'm going to name my first page cover, which is usually what it's called. The cover is like the beginning of the page. Imagine you have a book and the cover is the first page of your AMP story. Then you need another element called AMP story grid layer. And if it sounds very long, that's because it is. And it needs a mandatory attribute called template. And what template does is it's going to tell the browser how to arrange the elements that you put in. So for example, if we have a template fill, it's going to fill in the page with the next element. So let's do a template fill. Let me show you real quick. Template fill, and I'll copy and paste my cover image, which we saw earlier, okay? And all the elements that you put in an AMP story are your normal AMP HTML elements. For example, I'm using AMP-IMG, or you can use AMP-video. There are not a lot of components allowed in AMP stories, but if the components are allowed, then you can just go ahead and add them. Now let me save and test this to see if it works. And voila, we have our first page of our story, also known as the cover. And as you see, since I chose the template to be filled, the image is filling in the page, okay? And we also have our AMP validator Chrome plugin that's saying valid AMP, and this is just the beginning of our AMP story. And with our code right now, it is a completely valid AMP story. Okay, you have the AMP story wrapper element that is the parent of all the story pages. Then you have the AMP story page, and then you have AMP story grid layer, which is going to contain the content of the AMP story page. And in our case, it contains just an image, and it is filling in our page because we have chosen a template fill. And there are other templates that we're going to look in the detail later. So basically what we can do here is just copy the AMP story page, give it a different ID, for example, page 2, and this will count as a second AMP story page. Now let me reload, and as you see, if I am progressing and we see the same page, I'm going back, but it is counting as a valid AMP, and we only need to change the content, and this is a perfectly valid AMP story.